Hello, everybody. Welcome to Starfleet Tactical. It's Saturday night. I am here by myself. Pat had to work tonight. But if he were here, he would be the first person to say that what we have to say is not the opinion of any employer, past, present, or future. So now that I've got that out of the way. Sorry we had to cancel the show last week. Pat thought that he might be able to do it by himself, but then his schedule didn't let him do it. I, of course, was in Florida, so I wasn't able to do it. I was help cleaning out the apartment of my old friend Arias Kaufman, who passed away somewhat unexpectedly back in June. It was a bittersweet trip overall. I'm sure Pat and I will talk about it probably next week a little bit. We'll also talk about the travel to and from Florida, and the part where I didn't have to buy a new car on the way back. It was looking kind of dicey there for a moment, but everything worked out really well, and I got a chance to meet Wright Sublette in person, and he took me to a wonderful bar that had a very fine steak. It was really great because it turns out he lives down fairly close to where I was going to be. And so he took me out, and I appreciate the hospitality from the locals. So that was good. But we'll have more of a conversation about that later. So I'm going to do a little solo presentation this evening, and it's something that Pat and I had done together. We first put it together back in 2013 for the first HonorCon conference. Pat and I are both members of U9, which is David Weber's analytic visualization team. So we're basically we understand the Honorverse, and we help him figure out the Honorverse and give him support for things like that. And so we put this together. We ran a conference, a science fiction convention back in 2013. We really tried to do something different, something unlike most science fiction conventions, because most conventions are very heavy on panels. They'll have a few presentations, and they have a lot of other events like Filk events and stuff like that, and a masquerade and stuff like that. We actually sort of trimmed it down so it looked sort of like what happens. It looked like the love child between an academic conference and a science fiction convention. So it was mostly presentations. They were a little bit longer. We didn't have a filking track. We didn't have a masquerade, et cetera, et cetera. It was really us trying to do the core dump on everything that we could tell you about the Honorverse as of 2013. And so we did that conference way back then, and Pat and I put together this presentation as part of that, because Pat and I are both Naval War College graduates. I did the long course, so I've got a master's from the Naval War College. And Pat did the short version of that to get his joint professional military education phase 1. And with that in mind, I think let me take a quick look here at chat and see if there's anything I want to respond to. Looks like everybody's a fan of Buddy. Buddy was right here until about 3 minutes ago, right before we started. Buddy had been like right here as I was trying to set things up, getting in the way, et cetera, et cetera. But now that the show has started, he's gotten camera shy. So I expect he'll come back at some point towards the end of the show. But in any event, Lissa, if you could go ahead and share the presentation that I put up. All right, let me adjust the sizing just a little bit. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about something we call the Honorverse Strategic Overview, or Why Manticore Won the War. And so it was mostly put together by myself and Pat Doyle. Andy Presby helped out some. There's an online article version of it that was up on the Bain website at one point. This is actually version 2.0 of this talk. The original talk we did back in 2013 had a little bit different focus than this one did. We decided that basically what we did in 2013 was really kind of the 102 version of it. It wasn't the 101 version of it. So I sort of dialed back a little bit and did a version that starts off at a little bit different starting spot, because it's sort of essential to sort of figure out where things are going. And so this is the version 2.0 of this particular talk. But it was mostly Pat and I that put it together. Andy Presby, who's also has JPME Phase 1, spent a lot of time vetting it and throwing things in, etc. So Andy owns a good piece of this too. So let's see, taking a quick little look here, see if we got anything. Okay, so alrighty then, let's get started then. So most of this is not going to come as any surprise to anyone who watches our show on a regular basis. But for those who are seeing this for the first time, Pat and I are science fiction fans who have some experience as war game designers. I've done most of my war game designing for DoD, although I've done some designs for fun on the side. Pat actually has a war game that was published like 20 years ago, called Squadron Commander 3600, if I remember correctly, and he's still working on designs to this day. And he's also written books in support of Amarillo Design Bureau products. We're both founding members of BU9. We were there at the creation back around 2008 or so. We really only sort of became an official entity around 2011, 2012, but we started calling ourselves BU9 back around 2008. We're both naval professionals. I don't currently work for the Navy, but I worked in support of the Navy for about 5 years, and I worked directly for the Navy for 5 years, and I worked for another part of DoD doing naval stuff, working very strongly with naval folks as a naval analyst for 9 years. We're both graduates of the Naval War College. I was a graduate with distinction. I did the night school version, but I did it in Newport. I did the faculty by day, student by night route. And as usual, we don't speak for any employer, past, present, or future. We also don't speak for David Weber, and we don't speak for BU9 in this regard. But this is, everybody else in BU9 has pretty much seen it, and nobody's really thrown rocks at us for this. BU9 is an organization that works really hard to bring our professional expertise to the Honorverse. So everybody in BU9 has there's something that they are really, really good at. It's not a fan club. It's an analytic organization, including what I call analytic visualization. So that means that some of the analysis we've done are high quality artwork. So we have some people that do high quality 3D artwork associated with it, including one guy who gets paid professionally as an artist. So this is a strategic overview of the Honorverse as seen through the eyes of a couple of Naval War College graduates. It's an attempt to use our real-world knowledge to inform science fiction and science fiction fans. And that's really kind of what this show is about from beginning to end, right? That's what Pat and I try to do as sort of on a regular basis. And you can sort of think of it as probably more accurately, the intro, a de facto intro to the Naval War College course, and that we talk about some of the things that they cover early on at the Naval War College. What this talk isn't, on the other hand, is a blow-by-blow summary of the war, or either of the versions of the war that we see in the Honorverse. It's not the complete War College course. And like I said, it's not the words of David Weber or the opinion of our employers. Now, I am going to normally I've got these little comments in the lower right-hand corner or wherever that I'll leave to you to read. I will point out something about this particular one where I'm quoting myself, because it's sort of a little bugaboo of mine. If you go to Newport, you almost by definition end up studying dead Germans. Specifically, Clausewitz is the dead German that everybody starts with up there. And there's that famous phrase of Clausewitz that war is the continuation of politics by other means, which is subject to a lot of interpretation, especially since that's not what Clausewitz said. He didn't say politics. He said politique. Politique is a German word that means simultaneously politics and policy. So that changes the world a lot when you realize that politique is a word that means policy just as much as politics, because it basically goes towards governments come up with policies, and if the war is consistent with your policy, then it is a continuation of it, and if it isn't, then why are you going to war to begin with? Now, you can make an argument that sometimes countries actually go to war when it's not a continuation of policy. Lee Harris from the Hoover Institution, in an essay entitled Al-Qaeda's Fantasy Ideology that came out in 2003, of which the original subtitle was War Without Clausewitz, makes a really good argument that some folks do not actually go to war as a continuation of politique by other means. He specifically gives an example of the war of the Italians versus Ethiopia, Mussolini versus Ethiopia, in that was really more about the fact that in Mussolini's eyes, the Italians are a conquering people. And if you are a conquering people, you have to conquer somebody. And so it was really closer to being performance art than it was to being anything that looked like policy. That having been said, I think it's fundamental to understanding Clausewitz to understand that Clausewitz used a word that has a different meaning than the English words. And if I were a translator translating Clausewitz's work and other people's works, I would specifically use, and I ran into a situation where a word is critical to the understanding, but doesn't translate cleanly into English, I would stick with the original word and explain why I'm doing that in a footnote. So sidebar aside, let's move on. So a few caveats. I'm not really going to talk about the Mason alignment. I'm not really going to talk about the end of it. I'm really sort of focused on, I'm not really talking about the Solarian League. I'm really kind of focused on where we were in 2013 when we originally put this together. It's all about Haven. It's all about Manticore. It's about Grayson and the Manticore Alliance versus Haven. There's lots of changes that take place over the time period, even of that subset of the books. I'm not going to get into the details of, like, Haven stops being the People's Republic and becomes a regular republic, et cetera, et cetera. I'm really going to sort of look at the big picture entities of Haven writ large and Manticore and her allies writ large. I'm going to use both of those terms very expansively. So when I say Haven, I mean Haven in all her various flavors. When I say Manticore, unless you should be able to tell by context, but a lot of times when I say Manticore, I'm really talking about the Manticore Alliance. I'm talking about Manticore, I'm talking about Grayson, I'm talking about all of the smaller allies that she had during the war. Not necessarily talking only about Manticore, although I will sort of focus in on Manticore on various pieces of it. So here's what I'm going to talk about. First of all, I'm going to do an introduction, which I just finished it. This is really sort of the end of that introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background in this universe. I'm going to talk about some important concepts, that I learned up in Newport. And then I'm going to talk about, pull together a few conclusions. And I'll try to sort of wrap it up in a bow. And then if we've got time, I'll go and look through the chat and see if there's any questions I can answer. So here's what I'm going to look at in the background refresher. So this is still sort of an outline of this particular section. I'm going to look first of all at the astrography of the situation, because it's really kind of critical. A few salient features of all the different parties involved, a description of the interstellar political situation, and then a more detailed description of the combatants. Unfortunately, one can't talk and drink at the same time, so sorry for the little delay there. So here's a map of the situation that we see. So a couple of things should stand out right away. First of all, the star empire of Manticore is small. Grayson is smaller. The Republic of Haven is much, much, much larger. I mean, basically, the Republic of Haven is just about the second largest political entity out there. other than the Solarian League itself. It's the largest. It's certainly the largest one in that part of space. And as a result of that, it's it's the 800-pound gorilla in this fight. Now, the Star Empire Manticore punches above its weight class, and one of the reasons why should also be obvious from the map, and that is the Manticore Wormhole Junction, which gives it connections to a lot of other places on the map. So this is a result. This is one of the key strengths that the Star Empire Manticore has. Earlier the Star Kingdom, then the Star Empire, in that it's got very good communications to a lot of different places, and it uses the economic might of being a good traffic point to make a lot of money, and as a result, it has a lot of capability. It can afford a lot of capability that an entity its size shouldn't normally have. So basically, the Star Empire Manticore woke up one day and discovered that it was basically at the equivalent of the Panama Canal. That's the way that we would think about it. And as a result of that, of being in that situation, they were able to make a lot of money and afford an in-depth research program and afford a relatively large navy. And they understood that if they wanted to, that the Manticore Wormhole Junction is both a blessing and a curse. That on the one hand, it is a tremendous resource, but on the other hand, they needed to fight it to protect it, right? It's sort of like if you wake up and you discover that you're on top of a gold mine in an area where there isn't really a police presence around, right? You on the one hand, you could make a lot of money, but on the other hand, everybody and their brother is going to be gunning for you. The Star Empire Manticore figured that out relatively early, and they took the appropriate steps. So a few salient features. There's some important differences from our world. One is that communications lag. That we have radio, we have undersea cables, etc. We can get information very fast to other parts of the planet. Whereas in this universe, news travels via ship, and everything travels at roughly the same speed. Now, roughly the same speed, the Wormhole Junction really sort of changes that. It's sort of like Manticore has its own equivalent of the telegraph in a way that nobody else does. So Manticore actually has the ability to have better communications to other governments, at least, and maybe to parts of the front. But it's not consistent across the board. If it's not near a Wormhole Junction endpoint, then you still have a situation where communications are relatively slow. There's also no national sensors to tell leadership back home what is happening. So, and by national sensors, I mean there's no equivalent of, say, a satellite that can look down from above and sort of watch the action and let the leadership know back home what's going on, right? There's no alternative way to get news other than to get a report that comes to them via a ship. And so that dramatically changes things. One of the things that people don't fully appreciate, for instance, when a carrier battle group or a carrier strike group goes to sea, is exactly how much of its support network is located back ashore. And I don't just mean, the oilers that come out and bring them fuel and the munition ships that resupply them. I don't just mean the resupply. I mean in terms of everything from mundane things like weather reports and meteorology, network support from the Space and Warfare Command, or whatever they call it now. I think they changed the name. You've got all these experts ashore that can do everything from just tell you what the weather is going to be like, to provide you with extra expertise on things that you've got some local capability, to entire agencies that you can task. Right? Carrier Battle Group goes to war, and the Office of Naval Intelligence spins up to support those guys because they're doing an operational mission. You don't have any equivalent of that. Basically, in the Honorverse, if you want a capability in a battle, you have to bring it along with you. If you want it in the theater, you have to have it yourself. You can't just ask for, an update. As a result of all of this, it looks more like the early 19th century than the 21st century, except, of course, for firing thousands of missiles and nuclear weapons and all the rest of it. The firepower is really pretty impressive. Firepower does not look anything at all like the Age of Sail. It really is just quite tremendous, even at the beginning of the books. But other than that, it really kind of looks like the early 19th century. And I'll note, though, there's a comment that Jerry Pournelle makes in one of the essays he wrote about the Mote in God's Eye, where he specifically says that, the Navy in his universe is not an Age of Sail Navy, it's an Age of Steam Navy. And that's a very good point. And what he meant by that was, this is not a world where you can repair your starship by, pulling into orbit, finding a forest, cutting down some trees, and now you can repair your starship just because you've got carpenters on board and your starship's made out of wood, right? In the Age of Steam, if you take serious damage, you need a shipyard to get fixed, right? You can sort of shore things up, you can get it moving, etc. But if you've got big holes in the hull, the best you can do is put a temporary patch on, and then you have to go back to a well-equipped shipyard in order to figure things out. And that's really kind of the world that we're living in the Universe too. Okay, so the political situation at the time is that there's no supranational political entities, right? So there's nothing that looks like the UN. There is a system of interstellar law, sort of in the same way that we have international law and the law of the sea, and all these things existed before the UN existed. And you do have the 800-pound gorilla of the Solarian League, which enforces certain norms. The Eridani Edict against using weapons of mass destruction against civilian populations, and the Cherwell Convention on Slavery. And the Solarian League basically said that with the Eridani Edict, that if somebody violates the Eridani Edict, they will go and make them pay for it. And the Cherwell Convention was something that most powers signed up to, but the Solarian League really took upon itself the necessity of enforcing that. So in the same way that the Brits enforced anti-slavery conventions in the 19th century, and tail end of the 18th century, if I remember correctly. So basically, Britain took it upon herself that she was going to end slavery because there had been a consensus that slavery should be ended. But she was the 800-pound gorilla, and so she really kind of enforced that. The other thing about this is that, relatively speaking, the Star Kingdom of Manticore and the People's Republic of Haven and all the other powers associated with this are really kind of out on the rim of space. And it's kind of weird with the Star Kingdom in particular, because if you go back to that map, you'll see that, on the one hand, they're on the rim of space, but on the other hand, they're connected to Beowulf, which is one of the core systems. So it's kind of funny the way, as it turns out, that the Solarians are so ignorant, because it's mostly for political reasons, not for actually not having access to the information, so ignorant about what's going on out in the frontier. They just kind of know that there's a war going on out there, when in reality, the Beowulfers are very close to the Manticorans, and they're one of the core members of the League. You would think that the Solarian government would have a better idea of what's going on, but it says a lot about their political situation that they didn't, because nobody bothered to tell them. Intel officers who tried to basically speak truth to power found out the problems with speaking truth to power. Star Kingdom of Manticore, as I said, is punching way above its weight class. The Wormhole Junction and the Merchant Marine that Wormhole Junction supports allows them to be a very rich power, the richest power on a per capita basis in the galaxy at the time. They've got a first-class navy, second to none, even more dominant over the Solarian League than anybody really expected. But they really lack strategic depth. They're really only one main system and a couple of subsidiary systems, and they just don't have space to trade for time in case of invasion or something like that. Basically, They all, there's a couple of battles where if they lose the battle, they lose the war. The People's Republic of Haven, on the other hand, is a colossus. It's huge. It's got lots of strategic depth, but it really has feet of clay because it has some significant weaknesses. On a per capita basis, it's not a very productive economy. It's just big, but it's not particularly efficient, and you have to maintain, because on the per capita basis, you have to maintain the social standards for a large population. You don't have a whole lot of excess resources to do that. Historically, it's been looked upon favorably by the rest of humanity, but because it is out on the periphery, it used to be a shining beacon of hope, and it hasn't been that way for a long time. And that word really hasn't gotten back into the Solarian League. So the Solarian League has a tendency to still view them as being one of the good guys when they're not really one of the good guys anymore. So this is kind of what they all look like at the start. I'm not going to go through this entire chart, but the important thing here is that Haven is big, so quantity has a quality all of its own. It's got a lot of resources, got a lot of strategic depth, but in general terms, it gets there by being big. It has a lot of resources because it's big, not because it's particularly efficient. Manticore, on the other hand, is really first class in a lot of ways. Doesn't have a whole lot of strategic depth, has a surprisingly large naval manpower reserve, and they saw the war coming, so they've been preparing for it. So they developed a first-class navy. They understand that their tech and R&D advantage is all that's going to save them in the end. So they they work to promote those things. Grayson starts out reasonably backward, but they've gotten certain advantages. They've got an economy that has a lot of potential. It's got a lot of people that are highly trained for the economy that they have, and it's going to be relatively easy to equip them to be to bring them up to the Manticorean standard. Right? They've got a huge off-planet industrial base that's just waiting for all the upgrades to come in that Manticore can give them, and so they've got a lot of capability that they can run with, and they're also just sort of accustomed to sacrifice. I mean, they're in their own way, they're sort of like the Fremen in Dune, not quite as extreme, but close. They live on a planet where they're very proud of the fact that they survived at all, and they've built an awful lot. And the Manticorans are going to come along and give them what they need to sort of multiply that foundation and turn it into really sort of a first-class nation. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of important concepts, and I'm going to limit this conversation to just two of them, one of which is center of gravity, in the strategic sense, and one of them is the elements of national power. And these are the sorts of things that if you go off to the Naval War College, you talk about these things. They're useful models in terms of understanding how the world works and understanding how strategy works. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. These models are useful. So, quick overview of center of gravity. Actually, before I do an overview of center of gravity, I should say center of gravity is kind of an interesting concept in that all of the theorists generally have different definitions of it, and there's constant debate over what exactly center of gravity means. I'm going to give you the closest thing there is to an orthodox Naval War College view of center of gravity. But if you find this interesting, I would encourage you to go and look this up, because there's a lot of different people that have written a lot of things about it. It's one of those things where use it to the degree that it's useful. It should promote the types of thinking and the types of questions that allows you to develop better strategy. And it's not worth getting wrapped around the axle about one definition versus another definition of it. It should be a useful tool, and use it, and use it as long as it's useful. So, center of gravity is generally viewed as the source of power. It's how the combatant derives its freedom of action, its physical strength, will to fight, whatever. It's what gives it the ability to fight the war. They can change over time as the situation changes over time. It's not quite the same as critical vulnerability. Your center of gravity could be a critical vulnerability, but critical vulnerability can be thought of as chinks in the armor. It's the place where, like, if you get a good stab into there, you can wedge something between the armor plates, and you might be able to cause serious problems. But the center of gravity is really sort of the thing where, if you can have multiple critical vulnerabilities, but in general, the consensus seems to be that you can only have one center of gravity. You can win the war by chipping away at various critical vulnerabilities, by just rolling up their territory, et cetera, but generally the most direct path, the most efficient path, is to go after the enemy center of gravity. And so, like, if the enemy center of gravity is their capital, in some countries it really is the capital. You take the capital, and everything else just falls apart. In which case, take the capital. Your opponent is probably thinking in these same terms, so you need to be aware of that. All of this is an art, not a science. And I will admit that I spent my time at Newport really, really surprised that at no point did any of the instructors talk about this in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Seems to me that the language of necessary and sufficient, or necessary or sufficient, is exactly the sort of language that this conversation should be taking place in. I've never heard a center of gravity conversation taken place in those terms where it wasn't started by me. And that, I will admit, just kind of baffles me. So let's look at Manticore's center of gravity. There's a few candidates here. The Navy is one. If they don't have the Navy, they're using the Navy to fight the war. The home system is one, right? It's got a tremendous amount of industrial production. The Wormhole Junction in specific is one. I would argue that it's the Wormhole Junction, in that it's the source of their money, it's the source of their communications, and it's a force multiplier in that it gives them interior lines. It lets them move forces around faster. So I think the Wormhole Junction and use of the Wormhole Junction is really sort of key here. So I would say that it's the center of gravity. That's what I would put it as. But the Manticore home system really is a critical vulnerability because, like I said earlier, they just don't have any strategic depth. You take the home system, you seriously threaten the home system, and it causes Manticore to shift all their forces around. If you take the home system, then Manticore's out of the war, right? And the alliance collapses. There's no way that Grayson and Erewhon can win that war without Manticore. Manticore might be able to win it without Grayson. Certainly could win it without Erewhon. But the other two can't survive without Manticore being there. And just by that fact causes them to consistently have to prioritize defense of the home system, which is not to say that the Havenites don't prioritize the defense of their capital, but Nouveau Paris just isn't as important as the Manticore home system is. And you sort of see that. There's the one scene, and I forget which book it is. I did all the books on audiobook, so I don't have the constant reinforcement of picking up the book and seeing the cover, so I never remembered the names of any of the books. But there's the book where the Havenites are attacking Basilisk, and Whitehaven is at Trevor Star with a fleet. And he sends a note back to the Manticore home system to Jim. I can't think of the name of the local commander, saying, "You stay in place. I will reinforce from Trevor's star through the wormhole because this might be an attempt at drawing forces away from the home system. So even though there's a huge fleet right next door, they basically leave that fleet in place because they can't uncover the home system, because they understand what a huge vulnerability the Manticore home system is to them. So Haven has several candidates for center of gravity, and they all sort of are related to size. There's the size of the population. They've got a lot of people. They've got a huge industrial base. They've got a huge navy. They've got a lot of territory that they can give away. But all of these are really nebulous and diffuse in the way that Manticore's candidates are not. All of Manticore's candidates are very specific, and in some cases, very, very concentrated, whereas all the Haven candidates are very diffuse. On the one hand, that translates into a huge amount of strategic depth for Haven. They can lose star system after star system after star system, and it's only a small reduction of their industrial base, a small reduction of their population, right? They can lose stuff left and right in a way that Manticore can't. Manticore can't really beat them by just doing the Pac-Man thing and gobbling them up, whereas Haven can definitely gobble up Manticore. Manticore's got to beat them by going for the jugular. Now, the regime is really the critical vulnerability there, because the regime goes down. This isn't the sort of place where the new regime comes in and it's the same. They just sort of pick up where the previous people left off. When you have regime change in Haven, it changes the entire character of the war, and their first inclination was to make peace. Nouveau Paris really is the prestige center there. So from that standpoint, it's potentially a vulnerability. It may not be the be-all and end-all critical vulnerability, but it is something that has to be protected in a way that the other nations, the other planets, don't have to be protected. But when push comes to shove, I'm unwilling to say that Nouveau Paris is actually the center of gravity. I'm inclined to just sort of think that the center of gravity for Haven is size. It's big. It's diffuse. It's really just that against, in particular, a smaller star nation like Manticore, it's just a tough nut to crack. It can't be swallowed whole. It can't even really be sort of nibbled to death on any sort of reasonable timescale. And so just its sheer size ends up being the center of gravity for Haven. So let's talk about the elements of national power. Now, when I say elements of national power, I made a reference to DIME. And DIME is an acronym that stands for diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. So those are the tools that a nation has to work with in dealing with other powers. Now, like all DoD acronyms, over time, they have a tendency to get larger. The largest version of DIME I've seen is DIME Filch, where the F stands for financial, and I forget what the second I stands for, and there's a legal component, and this and that and the other thing. I personally am of the opinion that most of the time when when people make acronyms like that bigger, they don't necessarily make them better. They're trying to bring into sharp focus individual things that were already implied. For instance, economic, I would argue, implies financial. I don't really see a need to call that out separately. I don't see how that makes it better than just sort of explaining that economic includes financial. Economic and diplomatic probably include legal stuff too, for instance. I don't see why you have to expand it. I think that command and control works just as well as C4ISR in that regard. If you understand what command and control is, everything else is sort of implied. I will say that DIME is not to be confused with PMISI, political, military, economic, social, infrastructure, and information. That's a related concept, but that really is how you describe a nation. It's not the tools, it's the attributes they have. So if you want to put this in role-playing game terms, Pamisi is really closer to your stats, whereas Dime is closer to your stuff, right? You know, I have charisma, but I also have a sword. And that's kind of the difference between those two. So Manticore has a lot of elements, uses its elements of national power as a multi-pronged effort that started way before the beginning of the war because they saw this war coming. They tried to make sure the Solarians stayed out of it, at the very least, but they sought allies locally. You know, they'd love to have the Solarians on their side. They weren't expecting it. They were actually much more afraid that the Solarians, based upon the previous goodwill of Haven, you know, Haven used to be one of the good guys. They were afraid the Solarians would go with the Havenites on the assumption that they would just believe them. And so they worked to make sure that the Solarians stayed neutral in the war, and they sought allies in other places. They supported the diplomatic efforts with informational efforts. They made sure the population at home understood why they were fighting. And they also had a first-class intelligence service. They leveraged their economic and technological advantages into a powerful military. And that included having a merchant marine, which formed a large naval manpower reserve that they could tap in the event of war, which they ended up doing. And from an economic standpoint, they had a large per capita productivity and a concentration of resources that allowed them, you know, they had a relatively small population that gave them a large per capita productivity, which meant that they could then have a lot of excess resources that they could use. Haven, on the other hand, had a much less sophisticated effort, and it heavily emphasized their military in a way that the Manticorean effort didn't. I don't want to say that Manticore didn't care about the military. They clearly cared a great deal, but they understood that there were the other elements of national power that they had to use also. The Havenites were not nearly as good at that. From a diplomatic standpoint, they really sort of coasted on their previous reputation, which is why the Manticorean effort was so much more effective. They had ham-fisted propaganda efforts, both internationally, on the interstellar stage, and domestically, that seemed to be mostly focused around damage control. They spent a lot of time trying to explain why, you know, the latest thing that happened wasn't, you know, why you shouldn't interpret it the way that it obviously should be interpreted. The military was really their main effort. Their economic power, while they had a lot of economic power, the system was fragile and focused on internal needs because it just wasn't very productive on a per capita basis. And as a result, because they had a large population, they really sort of had to concentrate on making sure that domestic needs were met. Because if domestic needs weren't met, they could find themselves in a situation where they had domestic uprisings that they would have to deal with. They were particularly well suited to dealing with domestic uprisings. You may recall that they still had battleships, which Manticore never built, and the rest of the galaxy had gotten rid of as being basically too slow to do the cruiser role and too small to really do the capital ship role. They still had battleships, though, because they used them for internal security, which says a lot about this state that they felt that they needed something that had the capability of sterilizing a planet for internal security. So I want to talk, to sort of wrap this up, about 4 important questions that you should ask yourself when you're doing analysis like this. And the idea of the theory of victory. And then I'll give a little summary of what we've done so far. And then if we've got time, I'll take a look at the chat and see what questions I can answer. If I don't have time to answer questions, I'll make a point, I'll answer them when I go through and try to pull the chat log and post it in the comment section, post answers in the comment section. So there are really 4 questions that you should start off with. What are the objectives in the desired end state? That's the ends. What are you trying to accomplish? What do you want the world to look like when you're done? That's your desired end state. What sequence of actions is most likely to achieve those objectives in the end state? So that's the ways. What are you what do you need to do to achieve those objectives? What resources are required to accomplish that sequence of actions? So you've got capabilities, you have resources that you can apply, but if your sequence of actions won't achieve the objectives, won't achieve the end state, then you fail the ways test. If you don't have the resources to actually implement those sequence of actions, you fail the means test. So all these things have to match up in order to make this work. And then what is the likely chance of failure or unacceptable results in performing that sequence of action? What's the risk if you go down this path? So it may be that, it's the chances of victory are uncertain, and if we lose, we cease to exist. Maybe you should be looking at an alternative to fighting. If you're able to answer those 4 questions, you should be able to articulate a theory of victory. And a theory of victory is just simply a simple declarative statement of the form, if we do A, B, and C, then we should be able to achieve this particular end state. And it should be realistic in that regard. They will welcome us as liberators is not a theory of victory. It's a pipe dream saying if we move through this section of their state, depriving them of their means of waging war, we will be able to beat them in the end because we will grow stronger while they're growing weaker. Right? Which is basically the theory of victory that we used against Japan. We deprived them of their resources. We sunk their navy. We brought our forces within range to be able to attack their factories to prevent them from replacing those forces. And that's basically how we beat the Japanese. In the case of the Germans, our theory of victory was if we get forces on the continent, we can then march on Berlin. You should be able to articulate a theory of victory. If you can't articulate a theory of victory that can stand up to scrutiny, then you really need to rethink what you're trying to accomplish. So, in summary, from a center of gravity perspective, Manticore leveraged the Wormhole Junction to provide them with internal communication, revenue, and just general resources to enable them to build a first-class navy and then fight the war. Haven's center of gravity was basically size. That's a very difficult center of gravity to neutralize, but it's also difficult for them to sort of concentrate, right? The same thing that gave them strategic depth also made it very, very difficult for them to sort of bring all their force in one location. They had to protect a very large area. From an elements and national power perspective, Manticore was clearly superior in its diplomatic efforts and clearly superior in its informational efforts. The military balance side of things was a lot closer, but Manticore had a lot higher quality, a lot higher technical level, and was able to counteract Haven quantity. And eventually, the quality differential became so great that Manticore was basically able to steamroller Haven in Operation Buttercup. So Manticore actually sort of did that twice. The second time it was a lot closer, but in both cases, Manticore was sufficiently ahead technologically that they were able to use their smaller quantity much more effectively in order to knock out Haven. And Manticore was able to focus its economic resources externally in a way that Haven was unable to do with their economic resources. A huge amount of the Haven economic resources had to be dedicated to internal production efforts, to maintaining the populace as they were, not focusing in externally on fighting the war. And so that's basically what I have for this evening. Got a few minutes left, so let me take a look real quick at the chat. See what I can find. If I can make the chat bigger. Oh, for some reason it's not letting me make the window bigger. Oh, I see what's going on. Okay. User error on my part. I'm going backwards. Yeah, Rob Davidoff said the theory we used against Japan also sounded like Sherman and the whole Mississippi and Western Front. I actually thought that there was a little hesitation there. That was me trying to decide whether I was going to use a Civil War analogy or a War in the Pacific analogy. Really applies in the Civil War. I decided to go with Japan because I know the campaigns in Japan a lot better than I do in the Civil War, but it also applies in the American Civil War. Let's see. Yeah, the Haven center of gravity is at strategic depth. I mean, it's basically size. It's really hard to. I spent a lot of time, way more time on Haven, thinking about the center of gravity for Haven than I did for Manticore, and it actually that actually illustrates a very important point about this. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. Different people have different perspectives, and you can have that argument with people, and in some cases somebody might disagree with you and what you say in that regard. It's not like there's only one right answer. Those conversations should be productive. They should give you a greater understanding of the situation. They should bring that out into the forefront of your thinking, which is really the important point here. It's not that I can necessarily just, the Haven center of gravity is X, right? It's useful if it's nice and clear, because then, write it on a Post-it note, tape it up on your computer monitor. That's what you should be thinking about when you're thinking about strategy. It's not clear, though, having that conversation, even just sort of, having an argument about it with somebody, should bring out the issues that you need to be thinking about in your own strategic planning when you're going against it. Sometimes these discussions can turn into how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin, which is why I say you should do this to the degree that it's useful. It's always useful to have at least a little bit of a conversation about center of gravity. Okay. I am scrolling up. Yeah, somebody says that it's Echoes of Honor that has the rapid transit scene, which is one of my all-time favorite scenes in the series. It's my favorite line is Ivor Terekhov saying, "Why is it that people like you always think you're more ruthless than people like me?" But I think my two favorite scenes are Whitehaven composing the message telling Astral Control at Manticore that he's going to do a fleet priority transit and clear the system. I'm coming through hot. That's one of my favorite scenes. The other one is when Honor's ship is about to be captured, and she sends the message to the captain who's got the remainder of the task force, telling him to clear out. And she concludes with, "These orders are non-discretionary." You do not have an option. You are hereby ordered to leave. Those are my two favorite scenes, I think, in the entire series. Um, yeah, I like the comment about Grayson's economy as an interesting parallel of something like a developing country today, except instead of a demographic surge, it's a productivity industrial capability surge. Um, Yeah, and it's sort of interesting in thinking about how how that works with regard to Grayson. The Grayson population was educated; they just didn't have the tech level. That really differentiates them from Haven. In that, the productivity of both was the same, approximately, right, for purposes of this discussion. You can sort of you can, if you squint, you can sort of look at the productivity of the Havenites, and you can look at the productivity of the Graysons and sort of go, "Oh, okay, yeah, they're about the same." The difference between them, though, is that the Graysons had a foundation to move forward. They had skill sets that were really, really useful, even with the newer technology, the ability to operate in spacesuits. They had a lot of EVA experience. They had way more people that were working in space than on a per capita basis than probably even Manticore did, because they had to do all their farming in space, because the land was so poisonous, and they were able to really make that work, which is really just pretty nifty. And so there was a foundation there that you could build on in a way that you didn't have with Haven. Okay, so I like the comment about Singapore and an alternate Earth. That works. Yeah, the Brits ended the slave trade. It could not and did not tackle established slavery in other nations. That's true. Um, they weren't really able to do anything more than than that, but that was enough. Yeah, somebody pointed out the anti-slavery task force for the British was first started around 1814, as I recall. I think that's about right. That's about what my memory says. If I remember correctly, Britain outlawed slavery in the empire a little bit earlier, but they didn't really become the Crusaders until about then, more or less. Don't if a real source tells you something differently about those dates, believe the real source. This is not my Jeopardy category. Okay. I see Wright came in late. Right, talked about you at the beginning. You'll have to go back and rewatch it. Um, okay. I'm going backwards, and I think I'm back to about the beginning. So I'm still gonna download the transcript, still maybe put some comments in and stuff like that. And I'll do all that stuff. But that's about it for this evening. So in the future, I can tell you what, Pat and I were working on a talk where we were going to look through various episodes of Star Trek that never happened. Because one of Pat's comments is all the best episodes of Star Trek are episodes that never happened, like yesterday's Enterprise, right? The actions they take during the episode make sure that the episode never happens. There's the episode where Cisco has a dream. There's the episode where Cisco has become unstuck in time, and Jake has to try to get him back. There's the episode in Enterprise where uh, the what's his name, Scott Bakula, Archer. Archer is infected with some temporal parasite or something like that, and as a result, loses command of the Enterprise, and then they end up losing the war, and he has to go back and fix it. They have to fix that. There's a bunch of episodes that the Inner Light is one also, aka the one with the flute, where that's a little bit different. It doesn't involve time travel or anything like that. But it does involve a life that is lived that turns out not to actually have been real. And so you've got a couple of different episodes of that. We were going to go through and sort of talk about that. So that's still on the still in the batter's box. And then I've, for years, have given out a 3x5 card of my naval science fiction book recommendations. I've got some nonfiction books and I've got a bunch of fiction books. I started working on that presentation for today. Decided that it needed a little bit more work than I had the time and the energy to do. But basically, I'm going to give you a list of books that I really like. To a large degree, they overlap with my favorite books, but they're not explicitly my favorite books. They're ones that I find interesting from the perspective of a naval analyst. And so that one was probably the presentation that I'll do the next time that I'm solo. But I think Pat's going to be around next week, in which case we'll do that talk about the different Star Trek episodes. And so, with that in mind, I think there's no reason to drag this out any longer. So let's go ahead and call it a night. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been a pleasure as always. See you next week.